When the air becomes crisper than a green apple straight from the tree, and Starbucks begins blending everything even faintly nostalgic of the holidays with a shot or five of espresso and pours them into greatly anticipated seasonal cups, the residents in the little house know that it is time to create our Thanksgiving battle plan. The Pixies eagerly pour through family recipes handed down over the generations for inspiration, though most of the offerings are made from memory or by taste at this point. An extravagant menu is laid out, and a list is crafted to ensure the procurement of necessary ingredients from various local markets. Our calendar is carefully notated to create a precise roadmap for the week's preparation of pies, breads, stuffings, brines for turkeys, as there's always two, and additional elements of the feast and all its trimmings. The air within the house practically drips with the anticipation of the day, for that morning in front of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. The fire crackling as the first hints of turkeys roasting fills the little house, and the table, having been previously adorned in its finest wares, waits impatiently for the arrival of friends and family who will spend the afternoon and evening in relaxed conversation punctuated with laughter. The Pixies' very full family tree includes a legacy of loved ones who have never needed the least excuse to throw a party. And if one was already scheduled on the calendar by proclamation, well, who are they to argue with that level of wisdom? Perhaps our deep affection for this yearly tradition of gratitude to God for his blessings throughout the year hails from the Yankee side of the family, who were good and settled in New England long before anyone ever got the inkling to turn the water in Boston's harbor to English tea or to make themselves a proper republic, although it is my personal suspicion that a party was involved in the initial conception of both plans, probably hosted by an ancestor or two. Then again, maybe it's from the West Coast branch of the tree, who left New England after the ratio of folks to square feet got a bit too close for their liking, sending them westward until their toes hit the frothing surf of the Pacific Ocean, where they immediately took root. Either way, we're all pretty certain it wasn't the southern part of the family's idea, as there is absolutely no okra, crawfish, or boudin on any of our family's traditional holiday menus. And those menus haven't varied too far from their origins in at least a few hundred years, with recipes introduced from a ladies' magazine in the 50s still being eyed with suspicion as a newcomer to the table, albeit too delicious to be banned altogether. When I cooked my first Thanksgiving dinner, my grandmother, Betty O, was my enthusiastic instructor in all things bread stuffing related, patiently walking me through leaving my bread out on the counter to get stale for a couple days, the cubing of the now stale bread, the dicing of green apples, the chopping of onions and far too much celery, the exact proper amount of poultry seasoning denoted in her practical tone as being until everything is fragrant and tastes delicious. This was followed up with the perfect time to add the raisins and the turkey broth until the consistency of the mixture was perfect. And I followed her instructions to the letter. Until, in a moment of sheer audacity, I added dried cranberries alongside my raisins. And at that moment, New Englanders long in their graves flopped over in dismay. And I, completely unaware that my actions were likely responsible for the small earthquake beneath the original colonies, announced my addition to my grandmother very proudly. There was a yawning silence across the telephone wires, for what I could only assume was the time needed for Betty O to recover her composure before she responded to my excitement with a firm, "Dried cranberries are not in the original recipe and are unnecessary if you added the raisins," which I had. "But," she hurried to qualify, "I'm sure it was just fine." Her voice indicated that she, in fact, did not actually believe it was fine, and was attempting to be all right with my inadvertent rending of the fabric of tradition, while simultaneously not completely deflating my misplaced culinary initiative. Ah, curse the affliction of being a doting grandmother torn between the sacred tradition and the well-being of your firstborn granddaughter. From here, it should come as no surprise to you, dear viewer, that at no point was I invited to bring the bread stuffing to any Thanksgiving hosted at her home. Also, there are still dried cranberries swimming through my bread stuffing alongside the apparently superior raisins. Tradition is the mainstay of Thanksgiving, With roasted turkey center stage and his supporting cast so well entrenched in our culture, that whole industries are powered by this holiday. But it wasn't always the case. And here, you may be anticipating that we'll give a nod to the Pilgrims in their first feast. And while we absolutely will, there's a bit more to this story than was presented in your elementary school history book.
A little different than all the rest. I'm quite old-fashioned where I had sometimes played chess. And when I'm out, I'm looking for that vintage fling. But all complexions that I adore, so hard to find, these seem impossible to score. So I dream on to someday find that vintage love.
Please consider liking the video if you enjoy it. And if you haven't already, subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell icon to be notified when we release new videos. Thank you.
The winter that had bridged 1620 and 1621 was terrifyingly harsh on the coast of Massachusetts, reducing the residents of Plymouth colony by almost half their original number at its end. The subsequent harvest and the friendship of the Wampanoag tribe, who had taught the Englishmen the skills needed to persevere in an unfamiliar environment, were keenly appreciated by the small group of surviving Pilgrims. And thus, in the fashion of true Englishmen, a feast of Thanksgiving was proposed as recognition of God's blessings in their first year in the new land. And though they overlooked inviting the neighbors, as one ought to do if one plans on throwing a particularly raucous to-do, the neighbors showed up anyway, mostly to investigate why the English, who were usually a quiet bunch, were busy firing off their muskets and generally raising a hullabaloo. Realizing there was a block party going on, the entire Wampanoag tribe returned to join in on the festivities. Handily, the braves supplemented the meager feasting fare of the Pilgrims with $5 for slow roasting over the fire and copious amounts of seafood and wild fowl, all of which was consumed alongside winter squash, corn puddings, and native berries over the course of 3 days of eating, drinking, storytelling, and competitive contests. I think we can all agree that the locals really brought this party to the next level with their participation. Down the road a bit, in 1623, William Bradford wrote the first proclamation calling Plymouth colony to gather once again for a time of Thanksgiving. The 2 years in between celebrations had been grueling, leaving the colonists threadbare and on a tightly rationed diet. This season of struggle was brought to an end by the hand of God, when after a time of fasting and prayer, the long-absent rains revived the withering crops, and Miles Standish arrived with supplies and relayed the news that a Dutch ship would soon be arriving with greatly needed replenishments. This time around, the summertime day of Thanksgiving was a more solemn occasion. Over the next century and a half, colonists up and down the East Coast embraced autumn harvest festivals, and according to Harriet Beecher Stowe in her book describing the celebration of Thanksgiving in Old Town, they waited with great anticipation for the proclamation to be announced each year. In like spirit, George Washington, who had frequently called his troops together for a day of Thanksgiving after providential victories himself, wrote to the founding father, James Madison, in 1789, seeking the younger man's counsel as to whether he should petition Congress to allow him, as the newly seated president, to proclaim a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. On October 3rd of the same year, Washington announced the proclamation, making the first national day of Thanksgiving Thursday, the 26th of November. Despite periodic proclamations from the White House, the decision to celebrate a day of Thanksgiving remained largely in the hands of individual states and was not restricted to any particular day within the calendar year. By the early 1800s, all along the eastern seaboard, the celebration of a successful harvest continued a Yankee tradition going on 200 years unabated, and was embraced with great enthusiasm, pomp, and preparation in the heart of autumn each year. However, down south and in the Midwestern states, they were having none of it, considering the pushy Yankees and their ways an annoyance at best. While America had once had a common redcoat-wearing enemy to keep them tenuously united, now that they had been their own nation for a hot minute, things had started to get fractious. And the tradition of Thanksgiving was scathingly associated with abolitionists in the East by the Southern states. The Pixies' own home state of Louisiana didn't get with the Thanksgiving program until 1846, when word finally reached New Orleans that elsewhere in America, folks were having a giant party without them. The bayou reeled with dismay and corrected course immediately. Into the fray stepped Sarah Josepha Hale, a highly educated, dyed-in-the-wool Yankee who founded her first private girls' school at the young age of 18. 7 years later, she married her attorney husband, David Hale of Newport, New Hampshire, whose auspicious family had been foundational in the building of Dartmouth College. David encouraged his brilliant and talented new wife in writing articles and stories which were often picked up for publication by local newspapers. Until, quite unexpectedly, tragedy struck and Sarah lost her beloved husband a mere 9 years into their union. With 5 children under the age of 9 to feed and care for, decisions had to be made immediately, and with the help of her late husband's Masonic lodge, the ever-resilient young widow opened a hat shop, turning to her writing and resuming teaching for a supplemental income. Without complaint, and presumably on very little sleep, the industrious authoress published her first book, Poems for Our Children. Within the pages of this book was hidden the instant classic, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Overnight, Mary's reciprocated love for her faithful woolly companion caught the imagination of children everywhere, and undoubtedly left many an annoyed adult awake with the catchy little ditty running unbidden through their heads. In short order, a second book, this time a novel titled Northwood, A Tale of New England, was published and caught the attention of John Blake of Boston, who petitioned her to be the editor of his ladies' magazine. Her agreeance raised her to the position of first woman editoress in the Americas. As one would expect from this particular lady, she came into John's employ with a few ideas of her own, soon changing the title of the magazine to American Ladies Magazine and taking on each new project in her typical efficient manner. Several years into the arrangement, Louis Godey, who had since purchased the magazine from John, merged it with his Godey's Ladies book, retaining Hale as the motivating force behind the wildly popular periodical, which would become the most circulated publication of its time in America, eventually surpassing 150,000 subscribers under Hale's direction. Hale, whose day was obviously longer than the rest of ours, composed half of every magazine on her own, using her vision and formidable skills in writing and editing to shape cultural tastes, manners, family life, and emphasizing domestic science and the importance of the home. And on the side, she also continued to write and publish books. Her vision was for the empowerment of women to further education and development and economic independence. She used her well-deserved influence to help in the creation of Vassar College, in raising funds to construct the Bunker Hill Monument, and in saving George Washington's Mount Vernon estate, as well as in support of impoverished women and children. But ironically enough, the woman best known for writing Mary Had a Little Lamb is rarely remembered for arguably her hardest fought and victoriously won battle, that of making Thanksgiving a national holiday. Perhaps you, like the Pixies, were unaware that Thanksgiving hadn't sprung blithely from the fertile soils of Plymouth Colony and grabbed the number 2 holiday spot in America unassisted. Not to worry, this simply cannot be held against you, as it's certainly not found in most grade school history texts. Nonetheless, for decades, Sarah Hale devoted her free time, which we are entirely shocked she even had, to tirelessly writing articles calling for a nationally recognized Thanksgiving Day. Her publication proffered recipes and ideas for these ideal patriotic gatherings that she hoped would lead to a united American identity. She used her creative writing to imagine these celebrations that would remind individuals each year of their commonality and the blessings that they share. Tirelessly, she lobbied federal and state officials with the intent to have them adopt the National Day of Thanksgiving, arguing in favor of the unifying effects of such a plan. Slowly, individual states began to embrace her idea and implement them themselves, but the federal institutions stood resolute against it. Not one to be easily deterred, she continued to write congressmen, newspapers, secretaries of state, and to 5 different presidents, from Zachary Taylor to Abraham Lincoln. In September of 1863, she wrote 2 letters and sent them off by post, this time with renewed hopefulness. One was addressed to William Seward, the current Secretary of State, and the second was to President Abraham Lincoln himself. After decades of using every talent and resource she had available to her in the furtherance of her cause, Sarah found an advocate in Secretary Seward. The secretary, who knew all too well how broken and fragile the Republic was, immediately saw the wisdom in her postulation and did more than argue in favor of the permanent nationalization of a day of Thanksgiving with his friend Abraham Lincoln. Rather, he took the liberty of arriving at his meeting with the president with an already prepared proclamation ready to be signed. And just like that, within a week of writing her last round of correspondence, the proclamation for a National Day of Thanksgiving was announced, to be observed on the final Thursday of November each year. Both Seward and Lincoln hoped that the commonality of gratitude observed simultaneously among all people would ultimately help bring healing of the deep rifts left by the Civil War and establish a renewed unity among the states. Sarah Hale had penned eloquently time and again her deeply held belief that a heart filled with gratitude was entirely incompatible with hatred of a fellow countryman, and that a common bond could be formed when folks from every side of an issue could gather together and be reminded of the blessings bestowed upon them over that year. And for this wise and industrious woman, the resulting proclamation, after a 4-decade campaign, was a culmination of almost a lifetime of persuasive writing as she used her talents to build influence and her influence to effect change. And for our fractured country, it was a starting place, be it ever so tenuous at its beginning. Despite these humble beginnings, it wasn't long before the infectious New England enthusiasm for the holiday would take hold of the nation and bloom into a thriving industry. In 1873, a seaside Rhode Islander by the name of Horace Vos chose a large Meleagris gallipago from his flock of turkeys and, after dressing the bird, tucked it into a shipping crate and expressed it to Ulysses S. Grant at the White House for his Thanksgiving Day table. Vos, who became known as the Poultry King, continued the tradition for more than 4 decades. He chose his turkeys with a careful and knowledgeable eye, picking from among various New England farms and never selecting one that weighed less than 30 pounds. The chosen birds were then delivered to the president and vice president for both Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, with no respect to political affiliation. According to one account, he, Vos, was a hidebound nonpartisan, caring only that the finest turkeys were supplied to the occupants of the White House each year. Over the decades, Vos' reputation grew to be such that he had petitions from around the country and even received a request to ship a turkey to Queen Victoria. Upon Vos' death in 1913, it was rumored that despite the rush to fill his shoes by eager poultry farmers, the standard of turkeys sent from Rhode Island to the presidential residence fell drastically. And then there is the strange tradition of pardoning a turkey, which is said to have begun with President Lincoln when the live bird that was to be the family supper arrived at the White House, prompting Tad, the first son, to plead with his father to spare the condemned fowl. And as any good father would, Abe agreed, ending up with a grateful and loyal feathered pet for the first family. The first official pardon of a bird was in 1989 when President George H.W. Bush issued an official presidential pardon to a turkey who waddled off into retirement at a nearby children's farm. For this singular holiday, the USDA estimates that American tables will play host to approximately 46 million turkeys who did not receive a pardon from the president. And that's just the feathered variety, not taking into consideration your Uncle Joe or your Cousin Vera. The majority of these turkeys, the feathered variety mind you, are native Minnesotans, born and bred on one of the 650 turkey farms across the state, and leaving the other 49 states competing for a piece of the lucrative 30% turkey market share remaining. Except for Illinois, specifically Morton, Illinois, where they're pretty busy growing all the pumpkins. Ever since Elijah Dickinson wandered into Illinois from Kentucky with a pocket full of pumpkin seeds in the 1800s, Morton, Illinois has been cornering the market on canned pumpkin. The Dickinson pumpkin, with its beigey smooth exterior and thick rich flesh, is the secret behind the iconic Libby's pumpkin pie. In 1929, Dickinson and Company was bought by Libby McNeil and Libby, a packing company mostly specializing in canned meat up to this point, and who had astutely noticed the nostalgia of the rural New England life and Thanksgiving traditions in a population that was rapidly trending from country to cities. And once they had acquired all of those beautiful winter squash, the only real problem was what the heck to do with all that pumpkin. So, Libby's created a home economics department and set about developing a delicious pumpkin pie recipe that no modern housewife would be caught leaving off of her holiday menu, and which handily used Libby's newly canned pumpkin puree as its main ingredient. By the 1950s, their now famous pumpkin pie recipe was printed on the labels of their canned pumpkin and resulted in Libby's producing 85% of the canned pumpkin in the United States. In the 1970s, Libby's was purchased by the quick chocolate milk sipping rabbit as a member of the vast Nestle family, with their pumpkin puree continuing to be the main ingredient in approximately 90 million pies in the U.S. each year. The rabbit obviously made a clever investment. And finally, whose big idea was it anyway to stuff cranberries in a can in the form of a jelly? Well, we can all blame or thank Marcus L. Uran, a lawyer at the turn of the 20th century, who obviously got fed up with the law and sunk his hard-earned city money into a cranberry bog, which he imagined would be far more fulfilling than dealing with other legal minds. Realizing that cranberries have a relatively short season of about 6 weeks out of the year in which they produce, and must be consumed immediately, Marcus decided it would be necessary to extend his season a bit further out if he was going to make a go of his new career as a gentleman cranberry farmer. So off to work Marcus went, innovating the preserving of his harvest, joining forces by creating a cooperative with John Makepeace and Elizabeth Lee. By 1933, Cranberry Juice Cocktail was born, followed in 1941 by the star, gelled cranberry sauce in a can. And the whole of New England gasped in wondering delight as 200 cranberries mysteriously transformed into a silky gelled mass and slid from cans in a perfect cylindrical shape onto their crystal serving dishes. In 1946, and under the leadership of Uran, the top cranberry growers united to form the National Cranberry Association, which would be rebranded Ocean Spray in 1957. Today, the original cooperative has grown just a titch, encompassing over 700 family-owned farms and producing an estimated 70 million cans of delicious cranberry sauce yearly, mostly around the holidays. Because nothing goes quite as well with a roasted, smoked, or fried slice of turkey like cranberry sauce. While our current iteration of Thanksgiving feast would likely give the participants of that original celebration in Plymouth 400 years ago quite a start, we suspect they would find the blessings we have to be thankful for worthy of our tables. We also suspect they'd be the first to arrive on the big day to share in our feasts. And despite the addition of dried cranberries to my family stuffing recipe, I haven't really strayed too far from the traditions of my ancestors. With a plentiful array of cranberries, cornbread stuffing, artichoke stuffing, pumpkin, pecan, and vinegar pies, potatoes whipped to fluffy perfection, sweet potatoes swimming in a sticky, sweet rum glaze, gravy created with a white wine and broth base, vegetables in various incarnations, soft sourdough dinner rolls, and the infamous bread stuffing. I suspect Sarah Hale would approve. Who knows? She might even be brave enough to try my rebel stuffing. Or maybe not. From all of us in the little house, we hope that this holiday you're able to reflect on your blessings and to celebrate them in the manner of your choosing. And whether your feast is small and intimate, Charlie Brown level unconventional, or whether you party like a New Englander in the 1700s, we hope you will each have a very happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, y'all.
See you next time.
I will give thanks to you, Lord. With all my heart, I will tell of all your wonderful deeds. Psalms 9:1.